delegates, it's my pleasure to introduce one of the world's true subject matter experts on this topic, Professor Stephen Chan.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I wouldn't have described myself as a subject expert on this area. In fact, the whole thing began with a very slight impersonation, because although I'm Chinese by origin, I've lived outside China. In fact, my parents were refugees to New Zealand, and so I've spent very little time in China. And a very great deal of my involvement in the trilateral dialogue was very much as a result of a telephone call from the African Union saying, Stephen, come and join our delegation so that you can spook the Chinese. And the idea was that if they had, sitting with the Africans, a person who looked sufficiently Chinese, the Africans could all pretend to be overhearing exactly what the Chinese delegation was saying behind their back, and so they wouldn't say things behind their back. Now, in fact, as Miranda knows, I can't speak Putonghua at all. I come from southern descent, so I speak Cantonese. But the charade very much seemed to have the desired effect. But working on that particular trilateral dialogue, which took about 2 years, was very much an eye-opener, because what you've got is not just a Chinese relationship with Africa. You've got a Chinese relationship with Africa that is very much the subject of a very great deal of speculation and concern internationally, including in this country, and particularly in Washington, D.C. And a lot of these concerns are ill-founded, and a lot of these concerns are not going to go away in a very short period of time. So you've got an international climate of all kinds of anticipations and all kinds of dreads as to what the Chinese are going to do in Africa. The first thing I should say, however, is that when you're talking about the Chinese, you're talking about a unitary actor. One country, one very strong government, one very strong party. All the major corporate players in China are in one way or another tied to, if not directed by the party and government, and they can move swiftly and they can move on a very major scale, and they're doing that in key African locations. When you're talking about Africa, by contrast, you're talking about 53 different states, 45 of whom are sub-Saharan states. There might be 54 states if South Sudan becomes independent next year. But you're talking about a very, very large number of states, all with varying economic capacities. If you took in sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, and Nigeria out of the equation, then the total gross national product of the remaining countries would be less than that of Belgium. So you've got, as it were, a huge developmental need. The West has been, in various ways, trying to address that need. Unsuccessfully, I should hasten to add. The Western model has not gone down very well for a number of reasons that it's not my purpose to discuss here today, except to point out that the Chinese model does seem to be going down very, very well, particularly in terms of goods delivered on the ground, particularly infrastructural and civil engineering projects. There's hardly a person in many African countries that has not sat in a stadium watching football built by the Chinese, not gone to the theater to watch a play or a concert that was not built by the Chinese, not driven on a road that was not built by the Chinese. So all of these kinds of benefits come in a very deliberately purposeful manner, maximizing what the Chinese are good at doing, but also delivering a Chinese model of visible assets up front. Now, this comes with certain problems, but the first thing I wanted to say today was that the Chinese have been doing this for a great number of years. A very great deal of the concern in Washington now is about the coming of the Chinese. In fact, the Chinese have been there even before most African countries in the sub-Sahara became independent. In 1955, at the Bandung Conference of what became the non-aligned movement, Zhou Enlai, the premier of China, was there enunciating a philosophy of solidarity and cooperation with the emerging Afro-Asian nations. And 1 year later, in 1956, gave the first of what you might call the mega grant cycle. A mega grant was given to Egypt. Now, in those days, 56, that was 4.7 million US. You're probably looking at something like the equivalent of 4.7 billion now. And that was a grant to Egypt pretty much just to get the ball rolling, because you're looking between 1970 and 1977 of something like 2 billion US being donated to Africa by China. If you average it out over the years, up to the end of the Cold War, when, as it were, things eased off, you're looking at an average of something like 100 million US per African country. Now that's a huge investment for which very often there was no return whatsoever. So the whole idea of resource plunder, which is now associated with Chinese largesse, resource plunder from Africa, was certainly not the hallmark of the first incarnation of the Chinese in modern Africa. Now, a lot of this money went to support liberation movements, of which more anon, but also it established the hallmark of the great Chinese visible footprint of cooperation and of benefit. So that the great Tazara Railway that linked Zambia and Tanzania was built during this era. And the 550-mile Somali border road was built in this era. When you look at the locations of these great engineering projects and you see how hostile the terrain is, then you can understand just what was involved in these efforts. And these things left a huge impression on the African mind. So too did the military assistance to liberation movements, so that in 1980, when I was part of the transition from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, when that country finally won its liberation from white minority rule, and I was liaison officer with the colonels that commanded Robert Mugabe's guerrilla forces, when they knew that a Chinese person, no matter how such Chinese was coming to meet them, they would bring chopsticks so they could have dinner with me, because they had been instructed by Chinese military advisors and had nothing but kind words by way of their remembrance of what had been done to help them in their struggle. Now, this helps to explain certain residual and problematic relationships between China and Africa. One of the reasons why China sticks so resolutely beside the government of Sudan, for instance, is not just because they are the purchasers of something like 2/3 of all Sudanese oil, but in the days of the Cold War, when China was an international pariah, Sudan was the 4th African country to recognize China. Now that Sudan is the pariah of international relations, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to take 500 international criminal court indictments before the Chinese will stop repaying the debt and supporting the government of Sudan. So there's both, as it were, opportunism by way of resource expropriation from Sudan, but also very much repaying old debts which the Chinese are loath to forget.